Good evening, friends. I hope this is working. There was a little bit of a glitch when it suddenly went off, but hopefully it has restarted again. So, good evening, everybody. And as we are still continuing with our lockdown, with our distancing, we are not obviously going out, most of us. And believe me, we are privileged to be able to do this social distancing. A lot of people are still obviously in difficulties, and we must always remember them, but at the same time, reach out to each other. And I feel that this is a good time to talk about history, about heritage. And I'm glad other people also, particularly our intact, other intact walk leaders, are doing this as well. So today, as I promised, I'm going to talk about the heir of Begum Samru. Now, Begum Samru, you may have heard, many people do know about her, of course, and you may have heard Jaya's talk on Begum Samru just a couple of days ago. So, this was sort of inspired by that talk, and it has to do. Begum Samru did not have any children of her own, but she had an heir whom she adopted. Now, there's a little bit of a story behind that, which starts with Begum Samru's husband. Begum Samru's husband, Walter Reinhardt, um, nicknamed Sombre, and because he had a dark complexion, he was German. He was German. He came to India in the middle of the 18th century as a military adventurer. He became a soldier. He served with many as a freelancer with the French. He served in Calcutta. He served with Safdarjung for a bit. He served for a bit uh, with Mir Qasim in Bengal, and then came to North India and was with the Jats. With He raised a mercenary army of his own and help gave the services to whoever would the best bet at that point, and with Shah Alam II as well, so, who was the Mughal emperor at the time. So this was going while this was all on. He married a young woman in the mid 60s, I think 1764 or so. He married Begum Samru, who later became, her name was Farzana, later came to be known as Begum Samru because she was married to him. But he had already been married. His earlier wife, some say he was not really married to her, she was just a concubine, but be as it may, she was called Badi Bibi, and her son, he had a son by her who was called, he's been variously referred to as Louis Balthazar Sombre. His wife was Indian, by the way, uh, Walter Reinhardt's wife. Louis Balthazar, who later got the title from the Mughal emperor. They all got Mughal titles. He got the title from the Mughal emperor of Zafaryab Khan. Zafaryab Khan was an interesting man. He was just a little bit, he was actually just probably a little bit younger or maybe the same age as Farzana herself. Uh, and he was a poet. He was a poet. He spent quite a lot of time in Delhi. He was a rich man because his father was a very rich man, and he had inherited at least some of that wealth. And Begum Samru, as you probably know, had inherited the bulk of the property of her husband. She had, more importantly, inherited all his territories. He had territories, Sardana and others. Sardana was where she made her headquarters, and his armies. And so she was a very rich and powerful lady. Um, Zafaria Khan, for a while, had been put up as a sort of rival to her, but not really. His heart was not in it. He was not a military or ambitious kind of person. Doesn't seem like it. And he spent most of his time in Delhi. He was a holder of mushairas, so poetic. poets used to gather in his house and read their poems, and he used to have these gatherings. He was a poet himself. Also, some of his poetry has survived. He wrote in Farsi as well as Urdu. So that was Zafar. His takhallus was Sahab, and he had also converted to Catholicism, incidentally, when his father died in 1778. A couple of years after that, Begum Samru as well as Zafar Khan converted to Catholicism. They became Christians, Catholics specifically, in 1781, I think. So he was also Catholic, but uh, that is, of course, one incidental story. Now he married uh, a lady called Julianne. That's what the name. Actually, she came to be called Bahu Begum. Bahu Begum, and she also was uh, partly half Indian, half British, and he married her. As I said, she came to be called Bahu Begum, and they had one surviving daughter whose name was Juliana. And Juliana, I'm sorry for all the complications, but just so Juliana then is the granddaughter of Walter Reinhardt, Begum Samru's husband. Begum Samru's husband was 30 years older than her. So Walter Reinhardt's granddaughter, Juliana, that's the only granddaughter. And so Begum Samru did not have any children of her own. So she looked at these children and this son and grandson. Son, of course, had got into trouble by actually opposing her. But this granddaughter of her husband's, she thought very high, had a lot of expectations of her, and she married somebody called George Dyce. Now George Dyce again was the son of a Scottish father and an Indian mother, and he belonged to Calcutta, and she had Juliana married to him. Now, for a while, she had all her hopes on Juliana and George Dyce, and had in fact suggested that all her properties should go to George Dyce when she died. But she had a falling out with George Dyce for some reason, and then her attention moved to Juliana and George Dyce's son. Now, this boy had been born in 1808, and from the time he was born, she really kind of took him over in many ways. He came to live with her in Sardana, where she had a palace. Though, of course, she used to keep moving from Sardana to Delhi. She used to visit Delhi for extended periods as well. And he was named after Begum Samru's good friend, David Ochterlony. David Ochterlony was a British of the British East India Company. He was a general. He had been, he had been a part of the conquest of North India by the British East India Company. He was in Delhi. He was a resident for a while. So she named her husband's great grandson after uh, David Ochterlony. So he was called David Ochterlony Dyce Sombre. So this young man, who is, if you look at from the blood point of view, probably half European and half Indian. And as far as culture is concerned, really everybody acknowledged his first language was Hindi, Hindustani, as they called it often. So that's his first language. He wrote in Farsi also, but he was also given an English education to some extent, because while in Sardana, in Meerut, the chaplain of the church was one Reverend Fisher, and Begum Samru decided to send this boy for 4 years to live with Reverend Fisher and be educated with him. So he had a 4 years of an English education. So he was quite comfortable with. He had received an English education. He also mixed in the company of a lot of British officials who were particularly in Meerut, and when they came to Delhi, of course. So for instance, Charles Trevelyan, who was a young civil servant at that time, he met him several times, and so he mixed in that society, but he had really been raised in Begum Samru's house, so he was very, very Indian. And why this becomes important, you will find out a little later. So Begum Samru died in 1836, in January 1836, just before when David, I'll call him Dyce Sombre. Dyce Sombre was at that point. So she had left a will saying that she left everything to Dyce, her adopted son, and he had to take the family name of Sombre. So though his name was David Doctoloni Dyce, he added the Sombre after that. So he became David Doctoloni Dyce Sombre. So Dyce Sombre then finds himself in possession of a huge property. All the jagirs, the land, Sardana, and its surroundings, plus there was a little bit of dispute later about another property, which was another jagir, which was Badshahpur, but we don't need to go into that aspect too much. These had been, according to the agreement with the British, would lapse after the death of Begum Samru. So these, in fact, lapsed. She couldn't pass it on to her heir, but she had a lot of personal property as well. And apart from all the jewels and the all the immovable property in the sense of the palaces, and she had two houses in Delhi also. All that. Apart from that, she had about 50 lakhs in government securities. That was a huge amount of money at that point. So she left all this to her adoptive son. And what this guy then does is he decides to go to England, and he set off first to Calcutta. So there was a stipulation saying that he would come into possession of all this when he was 30. But at that point, he was just under 30, so he moved to Calcutta. He went to, and he still had quite a good allowance. So he went to Calcutta, and there his father was there. His father was still alive. His mother had died some time ago. His father was still alive, George Dyce, and George Dyce decides to file a case against him. The reason being that George Dyce said that he had been in the service, that he had been employed by Begum Samru and had not got his salary for 9 years. So that tied up Dyce Somre for a while in Calcutta. He spent quite a bit of time there trying to sort out all these issues. I think he managed to settle something with his father. His father then also died in the meanwhile. Quite soon after, I think in 1838, his father died. And then, having also come into become turned 30 and come into all this money, George Dyce Somre decided to leave for England. He came to England and he did a few things. First of all, in England, this money gave him access to a lot of high society. So he already knew a few people from India who were now in Britain. One of them was Charles Trevelyan, who had risen in British society to some extent, in the bureaucracy, etc. And Lord Combermere, who had been the governor, the sort of he'd been the commander in chief of in the Indian army, and he had now moved to Britain, back to Britain. So he had these people who introduced him to further people, etc. And so he started mixing in high society. The second thing he did was he started a case against the East India Company, because there was some dispute about that the Jagir, particularly Badshahpur, that Badshahpur Jagir, there was some dispute about whether or not the East India Company had been right or wrong in taking it over after the Begum's death. So that case, of course, dragged on for a long time. In fact, it was finally settled in 1872, long after Dyce Sombre had died. But anyhow, in the meanwhile, he does a couple of things. One of the things is that he actually met a young woman, Mary Ann Jarvis. Mary Ann Jarvis was the daughter of Viscount St. Vincent. She was a well connected, talented singer. She was a very well connected lady, of course, and a very talented singer, very vivacious lady. And Dyce Sombre fell in love with her and proposed marriage to her. Now, uh, and this was barely having known her 3 months. She agreed after a little while, and they had a rather long engagement because they kept fighting over things, broke it off, fought again, came back together again, fought again, but finally in 1840 they decided to get married. Uh, in the meanwhile, um, in I think in 1839, Dyce Sombre had even made a trip to Rome, and an interesting part of that, the reason behind going to Rome actually was to hold a mass for in memory of Begum Samru. So a huge mass was held very lavishly on a huge scale. The other thing he did was he commissioned a very well-known Italian sculptor, Adamo Tadolini, to carve this huge monument in Carrara marble for as for Begum Samru. So it shows all sorts of scenes. It shows Begum Samru on a throne. It shows the important courtiers like uh, Dyce Sombre himself standing at the foot of that, and various scenes and panels. This is a huge monument. If you go to the Sardana church, which Begum Samru had built, if you go there, you will see this monument. So he goes and commissions this. And he comes back, he marries Mary Ann Jarvis. Then comes a very interesting phase in that his activities in Britain, because he was a part of the Reform Club, and through that he got into British political circles. Now, at that time, British politics and particularly the process of election, etc., was in a state of flux. There was parliamentary reform happening, but it was open to all sorts of very strange goings on. And he managed to win the seat or get a ticket from either Radical Party to contest elections from Sudbury. Sudbury was a small was a parliamentary constituency. So he goes to Sudbury, and his main qualification was that he was willing to pay £3,000 to finance this election. And really, the way this election was financed was through bribery and corruption. the, his supporters managed to literally just pay voters to vote for him. Sudbury was notorious for its corruption. It was not Dyce Sombre who introduced that, so it was notorious for that. Anyhow, the money was spent. He did win. So this was in 41. In I think he entered Parliament in 1841 as a member of Parliament. Incidentally, that makes him the first Indian member of Parliament in Britain. I mean, people have argued that can we call him Indian, but I think he can. He was, if you're looking at blood, then okay, maybe he was half Indian. But if you're looking at his cultural and other moorings, he was born in India. He was raised in an Indian family. His first language was an Indian language. He's definitely Indian, so I think he qualifies. But anyhow, he didn't bring very much credit to that because this was a really dodgy election, and he was actually disqualified about 9 months later when there was a inquiry, and it was decided that this was there had been um, so much bribery and corruption that this election was set aside, and his seat it was cancelled. In fact, Sudbury was then disenfranchised. It stopped sending members of parliament. They just stopped it because it was just so notorious for corruption. So that was his election had been the last straw in a very long saga of corruption. Anyhow, so in the meanwhile, his personal life was also kind of falling apart because he had become extremely jealous of his wife. He, in the sense that he did not want her meeting any other men, he did not want her going out alone, and there was a lot of conflict about that. Now, he had shown these symptoms of this jealousy even before they had been married, and later a lot of people suggested, why did she marry him? And that is an important consideration. Uh, the friends of David Octolo, Dyce Sombre, said that the reason behind this was that he was applying what were then conventional ideas about um, Indian women in a particular class circumstances of not freely mixing with strange men, etc. And this was the reason why he was so jealous. Now, be that as it may, his wife, of course, and he became, and she, of course, said, you know, she didn't want any part of this. She didn't want any part of this, and therefore, he he became even more agitated. And they had these huge rows, and he became more irrational and more agitated until finally she got a few doctors and had him certified lunatic. Now, what happened then was that then there was this long procedure. First, he was put under the care and observation of doctors who decided that they would also evaluate him as well as make sure that he did not harm himself or harm others, all that kind of thing. And finally, because he was a man who was in possession of this huge property, there was a commission to try him for to settle this question of lunacy, which was held, and it was at the end of that commission. It was decided that he would be he was definitely lunatic. He had no, so his person as well as his estate, his own movements and activities as well as his property would be governed. There would be a committee which would be supervising it. His wife was given a lot of control over there. She was given a large allowance also. His allowance was cut down, his movements were cut down, and so for the next, so this happened in 43. From 43 onwards, for the next 8 years, he fought very hard to get this upturned. He managed to escape his minders in Britain, and he escaped to Paris. He escaped to Paris. He was given his allowance after a while, but he there also in Paris, he managed to get some doctors together. He got a lot of medical opinions proving that he was not to the effect that he was not off his head. He went to Petersburg and got some Russian specialists also to certify that he was in fact not lunatic. But it did not have any effect in the place where it mattered, in England, because all his property was in England, his wife was in England, and he managed not to be able to convince them. He also was in very poor health. A lot of people say it was because of venereal diseases that he had contracted. He kept going back to England from time to time for medical and other reasons. So in 1850 he went back to London, and in middle of 1851 he actually died. During all this, as a matter of interest, during all this tussle about his property, etc., two of his brothers-in-law had also come into the fray, because um, George Dyce had two other children, two daughters. One was Mary Ann, who was married to somebody who was John Troop. She was married to him, and these were all marriages which were arranged by Begum Samru for them. And the other daughter, Georgiana, was interestingly married to somebody called Paolo Solaroli. Now, Solarolis are very interesting because Solaroli then he was a mercenary soldier who was employed by Begum Samru, and he went on later. He went to back to Italy. He was Italian, and he went back to Italy. He became a soldier in the Sardinian army and rose so high that he became the first baron and then marquis, the Marquis of Briona. So he became a nobleman. So Georgiana became a nobleman. So you have Zafar Yab Khan's other line actually continuing in Italy. So you have these very interesting. So this was Dyce Sombre, a somewhat sad story of maybe in some ways cultural cultural disconnects. He, of course, had his own personal problems also, but cultural disconnects which led to these kind of difficulty fitting in, and also at the same time the there were so many people, because he was so rich, they often made things even more difficult, because a lot of people were interested not so much in him but what would happen to his property, how it would be divided. I mean, his own father fighting a case against him for money, or his sisters coming forward and wanting a share in his property. So these were all issues that dogged him to the end, and he died in 1851. So this is the very interesting story of the heir of Begum Samru, and India's first representative on in the British Parliament. Later on, of course, Dadabhai Nauroji was to come there, but yeah, this is the first. So there. I come to an end of that, and I would love to have any questions that you have. I will just have a look at them and try and answer them. Thank you. Ah, right. There we go. Thank you. Dost Khan, Zafaryab Khan was called Sahab. Bhagirath Palace. Bhagirath Palace, the building itself is there, Ramachandran Venkatesh. It's there. It's in a very bad condition. And Begum Samru had another Haveli in Chudiwala. Chudiwala, the Begum Samru's Haveli, I think nothing was left there because in 1857 this was being used as a gunpowder manufacturing place, and there was a huge explosion here. So that I think is gone. Walter Reinhardt, I think Walter Reinhardt was Catholic. Yeah. High or no? Sarai Julena. No, not this Julena. That was another Juliana of a earlier, slightly earlier generation. Uh, Hi, everybody. Uh, David Octoloni. Dushyant, David Octoloni was a great friend of the Begum. They were good friends. David Octoloni also had an Indian wife, Mubarak Unnisa. So they were good friends. He used to frequently visit her, and also she named him her husband's great grandson after her. Uh, this is not Rohan. There is no doctrine of lapse here because she was not a sovereign as such, but a jagirdar. There was a slight difference. She was not seen as a jagir. She was not seen as a sovereign or a princely, not a princely state as such. Thank you, everybody. Very true. Property, money. Sardana Church is quite interesting. It's very interesting. It's got all sorts of interesting amalgamation of styles, of course, and some very good sculpture. The British in Britain were more accepting of Anglo-Indians. Yes, to an extent, Simin, you're right, because there was not a question. There was no question of actually sharing power. Here in India, it was they needed to keep their status as a ruling class quite distinct. So I think maybe that was a very important condition. So in England, a lot of particularly Indians with money were always very, very accepted. And if you remember that, if you think about at a slightly later, even starting from this time only, many of the the princely states, many of the Maharajas were extremely popular in Britain because of the lavish lifestyles they had, all the parties they threw, and Dyce Sombre did the same. He threw beautiful parties where he would invite all his British friends, and also, so obviously that made him very popular. No, Simin, as I mentioned before, Juliana is not the same Juliana of the uh, earlier Ida. Dushyant, quite right, I think. No. No, Juliana Sarai was not the same Juliana. This Juliana was actually died very young also. She died when her children were very, very young. So she probably died before she was 30 years old. So she was not, she's not a very spoken about figure in this. She was probably a quiet young woman, very much dominated by the much stronger personality of Begum Samru. So I don't think she do. Anything known about the Italian line? I think I will do some research on this. It sounds interesting, but if you look at Solaroli of Briona, maybe we can find something. Did the sisters get a share of the property? No, they didn't. The sisters had actually got some amount of a allowance or an inheritance from Begum Samru, which was not bad. She had left them property, nowhere near what she left to Dyce Sombre, but she had given them a property. Thank you so much. Dyce Sombre did ultimately, when he died, his heir was his wife. His wife, of course, Mary Ann Sombre, but then later she married somebody by the name of Foster and became Mr. Forrester. So she was for Mrs. Forrester after him, and she was the one. Where did Octoloni reside? Octoloni actually lived in the building which is now known as Dara Shuko's library. It's in the campus of the Ambedkar University, and it is in that campus. Um, Thank you, Raja Vasim. Thank you very much. Uh, um, Yeah, I mean, Vidyanand Jha, you're very right. When he went to England, I mean, he had a huge amount of money. He threw that around. He threw parties. He drank. He consorted with all sorts of women. So he was, I mean, whom he lavished a huge amount of money on. So yes, of course, he was. He thought his whole purpose was to have a good time, and he decided to do that. So yes, it would say it was a debauched, but not unlike a lot of people who had been brought up in his kind of background at his time. Where did the properties in India go? A lot of the properties in India, particularly the palaces, etc., um, Mrs. Forrester then left them to the Catholic Church for various charities. I mean, not unreservedly. So, in fact, those bequests still continue because the Sardana Church, of course, is a church, but there was an old palace. There was, which is now a seminary, or rather, the palace, the newer palace that she built is now the St. John's College, and the older palace that they owned over there is now the seminary. So all these properties went to the Catholic Church. Akhtar Loni, yes, very true. Dost Khan, Akhtar Loni is uh, what he was known as. A lot of people have asked what happened to the personal property. I hope you have found your answer there. All the immovable property, of course, went to his wife, and a lot of the immovable property, she herself made sure that it went to various Catholic Church related charities in India. Swati Dasgupta, you're very right. That when Jules Verne wrote this book, whatever it's called, The Begum's Fortune, I think. Yes, the starting point is inspired by Begum Samru's story. Uh, any relative survivors of Begum Samru's family? I would be interested to know. I mean, I don't know if there are any. Then they would be from the from Georgiana's line or Mary Ann Troop's line. So that would be it, I guess. Mm. Um, Hi, Samru's son. You're talking about Zafaryab Khan, right? I think Zafaryab Khan. I'm sorry, I'll have to look that up. I don't know where he is buried. Uh, uh, I have answered what happened to his. Okay. Mosque near Hauz Qazi, Mubarak Begum, the Mubarak Begum who was Octoloni's wife, Mubarak Unnisa. You're right. Um, uh, why didn't Begum Samru gain much prominence in the British Empire? Uh, Her political importance was limited because, as I said, she was not a independent ruler in that sense. She was a jagirdar. She was one of the mercenary soldiers. Was not given that kind of status. She's important enough, I think. The problem is that a lot of times the British themselves have spoken about her. British of the 19th century, for instance, spoke about her as a curiosity, the fact that she was a woman and all that. So there's been all this sentimentality around her. She was important enough. Yeah, Raja Hussein, I think a lot of the immense property, of course, the immovable property all went to Mrs. Forrester. So it's her line that you have to look for all of that. And Ankita, you're quite right. Yes, the Solaroli, right? A very important person in the Second World, the Baron or Marquis of Solaroli. Who has Begum Samru's jewelry? Ah, interesting. I think a lot of that did go to Mrs. Forrester, Dyce Sombre's wife. Did Mrs. Forrester ever come to India? Hmm, interesting. Must look it up. No idea. True, true, true. Uh, no, the building, SBI building in Chandni Chowk near Bhagirat Palace has nothing to do with Begum Samru, apart from the fact that it probably stood on what was her property, because that the line of that property extended all the way to the main road. So, but otherwise, no. Uh, was Rajesh, you're right. This one's wife was Mrs. Dyce Sombre was not Catholic. She was Protestant. In fact, one of their arguments was about the children. So, what was decided was that between them decided that if they had sons, they would be raised Catholic and the daughters would be raised Protestant. Then, of course, what happened was that suddenly this guy gets it into his head, what if we don't have sons and we only have daughters? He said, okay, then if we only have daughters, they also must be Catholic. And she said no. So anyway, that was one of the things. Ultimately, it came to nothing because they did not have children. But yes, that was a point of contention also. So there we go. I've come to the end of the questions. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to further few talks like this, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to save this video, so if you would like to, if you missed the beginning, you would like to see that, catch up with that, or you want to suggest it to anybody else, you are most welcome. And thank you for joining me again. Good evening.